Every day, millions of people spend money believing they are making smart decisions. The shocking part is that the biggest financial mistakes are usually made when someone feels completely certain they are right. Why do wealthy people often wait before buying while everyone else rushes to pay? Why do marketers want you to make a decision as quickly as possible? And what simple rule has helped successful families protect their wealth for generations? In this video, you'll discover a secret that seems far too simple to be powerful. Yet it has helped some people build wealth, while others keep wondering where all their money went. Watch until the end. The most valuable lesson is still ahead. There is a paradox that at first glance seems inexplicable. A person can work for many years, build a career, develop a business, increase income, and be considered quite reasonable in financial matters. But at the same time, a single purchase can wipe out months of savings and set them back. The most surprising thing is that this happens not only to those who are bad with money. It regularly happens even to wealthy people who perfectly understand the value of hard-earned funds. Surely everyone has faced a similar situation at least once. In a store, on a website, or in a car dealership, a certain item suddenly began to seem absolutely necessary. A feeling arose that without it, life would literally lose some of its possibilities. At that moment, dozens of arguments in favor of the purchase appeared. It seemed that the decision was completely logical and thought out. However, a few days or weeks later, the initial enthusiasm vanished. Instead, an unpleasant question emerged. Why was this money spent at least? Interestingly, most financial mistakes are not born from a lack of knowledge. People know they need to save money. They know about the necessity of investing. They understand the importance of a financial safety net. Many even read books about wealth and watch educational materials. But when it comes to an actual purchase, knowledge suddenly takes a back seat. The reason is that at the moment of making a decision, a person is driven not by calculation. Far more often, emotions come into play. The desire to feel more successful, the urge to get pleasure right now, the fear of missing out on a lucrative opportunity, the desire to impress others. All of this works much stronger than it seems. That is why expensive things are often sold not through specifications and numbers. People are sold feelings. They are sold a lifestyle. They are sold a sense of exclusivity. It seems to a person that they are acquiring a useful item while in reality, they are buying an emotion that arose in their head a few minutes before payment. It is especially dangerous that the brain knows how to justify such decisions very convincingly. After a desire appears, it begins to look for arguments in its favor, and the stronger the emotion, the more convincing these explanations become. As a result, a person is sincerely convinced that they are acting rationally, even though they have long since made the decision on an emotional level. That is why one can meet people with high incomes who constantly experience a shortage of money. Their problem is not the size of their earnings. Their problem is that money leaves them faster than it has time to create real wealth. Each thoughtless purchase looks insignificant on its own, but over time, dozens of such decisions add up to huge sums. Many think that wealth is created solely through the ability to earn. However, history shows a completely different picture. In all times, there were people who received less than their neighbors, but over time became significantly wealthier. They did not possess any special talents. Their secret lay in the ability to control their own decisions. At the moment when the majority gave in to temptation, this is where the most interesting part of this story begins. Because one day, people who for centuries knew how to preserve and increase capital noticed a certain pattern. Practically every major financial mistake occurs in a very short window of time between the emergence of the desire and the moment of payment. And when they understood this, a simple principle appeared that allowed them to protect money from the most dangerous threat, from the person themselves. It is precisely in this short window of time that the trap lies, into which millions of people regularly fall. It does not look dangerous. On the contrary, everything happens so naturally that most do not even notice how they begin to lose control over their own decisions. Imagine a situation. You go into a store for one item and come out with several bags. Or you open an online store for just a couple of minutes to look up the price of a product you are interested in, and half an hour later, you are already entering payment details. Such cases are familiar to almost everyone. And it is not at all about a weak character or a lack of discipline. The modern world is designed in such a way as to accelerate decision-making. Everywhere, a person is pushed to act immediately. Messages appear on the screen stating that the discount will end in a few hours. Next to the product, a sign flashes about the last items in stock. Marketers know a specific feature of human psychology perfectly well. People are much more afraid of missing an opportunity than they are happy about a good purchase. For this reason, a sense of urgency has become one of the most powerful tools for influencing the buyer. When it seems to a person that there is no time for reflection, their ability to soberly assess the situation drops sharply. Instead of analysis, emotions begin to work. The thought arises, if I don't buy now, it will be too late. But in most cases, this is an illusion. A week later, the same product may quietly sit on the shelf. A month later, a more favorable offer may appear. Sometimes it turns out that the item was not needed at all. However, at the moment of making the decision, seeing this is extremely difficult. There is another feature that is rarely talked about. A person tends to overestimate the pleasure of a future purchase. While the item is before one's eyes, it seems that it will bring a lot of positive emotions and noticeably improve life. Imagination begins to paint the most attractive scenarios. But after the purchase, an interesting process occurs. The novelty gradually disappears. Emotions weaken, and the object that yesterday seemed vitally necessary becomes an ordinary part of everyday life. That is why many people can remember things they once really wanted to acquire, but today they hardly use them. At the moment of purchase, they were confident in the correctness of their choice. Moreover, they were ready to argue with anyone who would try to talk them out of it. But time showed a completely different picture. Decisions made under the influence of mood are especially dangerous. When a person experiences intense joy, they tend to spend more. When experiencing stress or fatigue, the situation often turns out to be the same. A purchase begins to be perceived as a way to get quick emotional relief. For a few minutes, the mood really improves. But then, only the spent amount remains. It is no coincidence that many financial losses occur not when a person is poor, but when they feel confident. An increase in income creates a sense of security. The thought appears that one purchase will change nothing. Then a second one appears. Then a third, and unnoticed, a habit forms that begins to consume more and more money. The most insidious thing is that each individual expense looks completely harmless. The problem becomes noticeable only years later, when a person tries to understand where tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands disappeared, which could have worked for their future. People who preserved capital for generations well understood this danger. They knew that the main threat to wealth rarely comes from the outside. Most often, it appears inside the person themselves. in the form of a sudden desire that seems reasonable and justified. That is why in some families, an approach gradually formed that allowed separating real necessity from a momentary impulse. At first glance, it may seem that wealth is created through special knowledge about money, investments, or business. Of course, all this matters. However, if you carefully study the history of families that managed to preserve capital over many generations, an interesting pattern becomes noticeable. Their strength lay not only in the ability to earn. Even more important was the ability not to lose what was already earned. In many Jewish families, the attitude toward money was formed long before a child began to independently manage their own funds. From an early age, a simple thought was explained to them. Money is earned over a long time, but it parts with a person very quickly. That is why every serious decision must pass the test of time. This approach did not appear by accident. Over the centuries, Jewish communities faced periods of instability, relocations, restrictions, and economic shocks. People understood that the well-being of the family depends not only on how much money was successfully earned today, but also on how reasonably it will be managed tomorrow. Gradually, a special financial culture was formed. In it, caution, calculation, and the ability to look beyond the current moment were valued. A purchase was never viewed as a way to quickly get pleasure. It was perceived as a decision that should bring benefits not only now, but also in the future. Interestingly, many wealthy people of the past rarely made large acquisitions immediately after a desire appeared. They understood an important feature of human nature. Emotions possess immense power, but extremely rarely turn out to be good financial advisors. What seems like a brilliant idea tonight may look completely different tomorrow morning. Therefore, in families where money was viewed as a tool for creating long-term well-being, the habit of deliberately slowing down the decision-making process appeared. When most people hurried to take advantage of an opportunity, they preferred to wait. When others acted under the influence of hype, they remained calm. From the outside, such behavior could look strange. Someone considered it excessive caution. Someone saw greed in it. However, the results spoke for themselves. While some people regularly bought things that quickly lost value, others directed money to where it could bring benefits for many years. Over time, it became obvious that between rich and poor people, there is another important difference. A poor person more often asks themselves, "Can I afford this purchase?" A rich person asks another question, "Is it worth parting with this money for?" At first glance, the difference seems insignificant, but it is precisely what changes the entire approach to finance. The first question is focused on today. The second forces one to think about the future. The first helps spend money. The second helps preserve and multiply it. Gradually, from such a worldview, a simple principle was born that did not require special knowledge, large capital, or complex calculations. It could be used by any person, regardless of income level. It was this principle that helped cut off a significant part of unnecessary expenses even before the money left the wallet. It turned out to be so simple that many at first did not believe in its effectiveness. But it was precisely in this simplicity that its strength lay. After all, sometimes to protect capital, one needs not complex financial strategies, but just a single action that allows emotions to give way to common sense. This action became a rule that at first glance seems too simple to change a person's financial life. That is why many underestimate its power. However, generations of people who know how to preserve and multiply capital came to the same conclusion. The most expensive mistakes are made in a hurry. The essence of the rule is extremely simple. Before any large purchase, it is necessary to pause for 24 hours. Not a few minutes, not 1 hour, not the time until the end of the working day. Exactly a day. When a desire to buy something expensive appears, a person does not tell themselves a categorical no. This is very important. A complete ban often causes internal resistance. Instead, they tell themselves, if tomorrow I think the same way, I can come back and buy this thing. At first glance, nothing changes. The purchase is not canceled. It is merely postponed. But it is precisely at this moment that the most interesting thing happens. The desire, which just recently seemed incredibly strong, begins to lose part of its power. The pressure of the moment disappears. Vivid emotions go away. The sense of urgency that forced a person to act immediately gradually weakens. Very often, already after a few hours, the first doubts appear. Questions arise that previously did not even cross one's mind. Is this thing really necessary? Will I be using it in a month? Will it improve my life as much as it seems to me now? Or did I just give in to beautiful advertising, someone else's opinion, or a momentary desire? Many people are surprised when they discover that after a day, the initial enthusiasm practically disappears. An item that yesterday seemed like an ideal acquisition suddenly begins to look ordinary. Some purchases stop causing interest altogether. That is why the 24-hour rule works much more effectively than attempts to constantly limit oneself. It does not require willpower over months. It does not force one to live in a mode of constant prohibitions. It simply creates a space between desire and action. This space becomes a kind of filter. Only truly important decisions pass through it. Everything else is left behind. Interestingly, many wealthy people use a similar principle, even when they can easily afford practically any purchase. It is not about saving every penny. It is about discipline of thought. A person gets used to making decisions consciously, rather than under the influence of random emotions. Imagine two different situations. In the first, a person saw an expensive thing, felt a strong desire, and immediately paid for the purchase. In the second, they saw the same product, but decided to wait until the next day. Formally, the difference is only 24 hours. However, the consequences of these decisions can differ by thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars over a lifetime. Each canceled unnecessary purchase leaves money where it can bring benefits. It can work for savings, investments, family security, or future opportunities. That is why the 24-hour rule cannot be viewed as a way to save. In reality, it is a tool for capital protection. But the most amazing part lies in something else. The main value of this rule is connected not even with money. Real changes happen inside the person themselves, because during these 24 hours, not only their decision changes, the way their brain assesses reality changes. And this is where the most interesting part begins. After all, 24 hours later, processes occur in a person's head that completely change the view on the purchase and make them see what yesterday remained unnoticed. When the first hours pass after the appearance of a desire to buy something, a person begins to look at the situation completely differently. That very product, which just recently seemed incredibly important, gradually loses its emotional appeal. A process occurs that is rarely noticed, but which has a huge impact on financial life. At the moment of strong desire, the brain is focused on benefits. It draws attractive pictures of the future. A new thing seems more useful, more expensive, more valuable, and more necessary than it actually is. A person mentally imagines how they will use the purchase, what pleasure it will bring, and how it will change their life. However, after some time, attention begins to shift. Emotional noise becomes quieter. Instead of enthusiasm, questions appear. Instead of dreams, analysis comes. It is then that a person for the first time begins to see the full picture. They remember other financial goals, about the money they plan to save, about projects that require investment, about things truly important for the family. Suddenly it turns out that every purchase has its price not only in money, but also in missed opportunities. This is a very important point that most people underestimate. When a person spends money, they give up not only a specific amount, they give up all options for using these funds in the future. And the larger the purchase, the more serious the consequences of such a choice. That is why 24 hours later, the brain begins to ask completely different questions. Not, do I want to buy this? But, what will I lose if I buy this? At first glance, the difference seems small, but it is precisely what separates emotional thinking from financial thinking. Gradually, details become noticeable that previously remained outside of attention. A person begins to take into account additional expenses, the cost of maintenance, possible repairs, the need for updates, the time that will have to be spent on using or maintaining the new thing. All of this rarely comes to mind in the first minutes after a desire arises. Sometimes an even more interesting thing happens. A person suddenly realizes that they wanted to acquire not the object itself. They needed a certain feeling, a feeling of success, a feeling of confidence, a feeling of belonging to a certain circle of people. But a purchase is not always capable of giving what a person is actually looking for. It is at this stage that many decisions begin to look completely different. What yesterday seemed like a necessity turns out today to be an ordinary whim. And some products, on the contrary, successfully pass this test of time. If after a day the item still seems truly necessary, this is already a good sign. It means the decision is gradually moving from the emotional category to the rational one. People who regularly use the 24-hour rule often notice an amazing pattern. Most spontaneous desires disappear by themselves, without a fight, without self-limitations, without a sense of deprivation. They simply dissolve because they were based on emotions, not on a real need. Over time, such a practice begins to change the very way of thinking. A person stops reacting to every attractive offer. They stop feeling the need to immediately pull out their wallet every time they encounter something new and interesting. Instead, the ability appears to calmly observe one's desires and make decisions consciously. This is where the difference begins to show between people who constantly work for money and those who make money work for their future. Because wealth is rarely ruined by one major mistake. Far more often, it is undermined by dozens of minor decisions made under the influence of the moment. And that is why the attitude toward purchases can differ so much among different people that over time, it leads to completely different financial results. From the outside, it may seem that rich people simply have more opportunities. They can afford expensive things, a comfortable lifestyle, and large purchases without serious consequences for the budget. But if you look closely at how a fortune is formed, something much more important becomes noticeable. The difference begins long before big money appears. Most people pay attention to the result, but rarely notice the process. They see a successful person, a good house, reliable assets, and financial stability. However, behind all this stand thousands of decisions that were made over many years. And very often, these decisions were connected not at all with earning, but with refusing unnecessary expenses. Some people perceive money as a tool for getting pleasure here and now. As soon as free funds appear, a desire arises to immediately exchange them for new purchases. The higher the income, the higher the level of expenses. Each increase in earnings quickly turns into a more expensive car, more prestigious things, a more luxurious lifestyle. At first glance, such an approach seems natural. After all, what else is there to work and earn more for? However, it is precisely here that a trap is hidden, which unnoticed keeps a huge number of people on the same financial level for decades. The problem is that income growth by no means always means a growth in well-being. A person can earn twice as much as 5 years ago, but at the same time feel the same lack of money. The reason is simple. Along with income, desires grew too. And following the desires, obligations grew. People who know how to create capital look at the situation differently. For them, money is not only an opportunity to buy something. It is, above all, freedom of choice in the future. Each spent amount passes through an additional filter. They evaluate not only the product itself, but also what they will lose after the purchase. For example, one person sees an expensive thing and thinks about how pleasant it will be to possess it. Another automatically asks themselves how much time and effort it took to earn this money. Then they begin to compare the purchase with other opportunities that could be obtained for the same amount. Such thinking seems less emotional, but it is precisely what gradually creates the difference between consumption and capital accumulation. Money stops being perceived as a means of instant satisfaction of desires. It begins to be viewed as a resource that should bring benefits over many years. Interestingly, wealthy people not infrequently refuse purchases they can easily afford, not because they grudge the money, and not because they live in constant economy. They simply understand the cost of each decision. They know that money possesses the ability to create new money, and the more often capital is left to work, the stronger its influence becomes in the future. At the same time, many people with limited financial possibilities make the opposite mistake. They strive to look richer before they actually become richer. They buy status they haven't earned yet. They create an impression of wealth instead of building the wealth itself. Over time, the consequences become obvious. One person owns things that gradually lose value. Another owns assets that work for him for years. One is constantly forced to maintain an expensive lifestyle. Another gets more and more freedom, thanks to decisions made many years ago. But there exists a special category of purchases where the price of a mistake becomes much higher. If an impulsive acquisition of an inexpensive thing can still be survived without serious consequences, some decisions are capable of influencing a person's financial position for many years. It is there that the 24-hour rule becomes especially important, because one mistake can turn out to be significantly more expensive than dozens of small, thoughtless expenses. The greatest danger is presented not by everyday expenses. Yes, it is minor expenses that gradually empty the wallet, but real financial consequences usually come together with large decisions. It is there that a single mistake is capable of crossing out the results of many years of labor. When a person buys an inexpensive thing under the influence of emotions, the damage is most often limited to the cost of the purchase itself. But when it comes to an expensive car, real estate, a major renovation, expensive equipment, or a serious loan, the situation becomes completely different. Here, the price of a mistake is measured no longer in days and weeks of work, but in months and even years. The problem is that large purchases cause especially strong emotions. The higher the sum, the more actively desires, expectations, and dreams turn on. A person begins to imagine a new life that will allegedly begin after the acquisition. It seems to them that it is precisely this purchase that will become an important step toward success, recognition, or comfort. In such moments, rational thinking finds itself under serious pressure. A dangerous feeling of confidence arises. It seems that the decision has already been made, and all that remains is to fill out the documents or transfer the money. That is why sellers of expensive goods often strive to accelerate the transaction process as much as possible. They perfectly understand. The longer a person reflects, the greater the probability that they will notice shortcomings and ask uncomfortable questions. The situation is especially insidious when a purchase is made on credit or installment. At this moment, a person's attention often switches from the full cost to the size of the monthly payment. Instead of the question, "How much does it cost?" the question, "Can I pay such an amount every month?" appears. And this changes the perception of reality. An expensive item begins to seem more accessible than it really is. The brain concentrates on a small figure in the monthly payment and stops noticing the total cost of the decision. As a result, people not infrequently take on obligations that will accompany them for many years. There is another mistake that occurs surprisingly often. Many buy large things, not because they are truly needed, but because they want to correspond to other people's expectations. The desire to make an impression is capable of costing very dearly. A car is acquired for the sake of status. A house is chosen for the sake of demonstrating success. Equipment is bought for the sake of the admiration of others. But the problem is that someone else's attention is always temporary. After a few days or weeks, others stop noticing your new purchase and return to their own affairs. And the financial consequences of the decision made remain with you for a long time. That is why people who know how to preserve capital are especially cautious in matters of large acquisitions. They understand that each big purchase influences not only today, but also the future. Money spent now will no longer be able to work for new opportunities, investments, or the financial security of the family. The 24-hour rule in such cases becomes the first line of defense. But many experienced investors and entrepreneurs go even further. For especially large sums, they increase the waiting period to several days, a week, or even a month. Not because they doubt themselves. On the contrary, because they know the price of hasty decisions. Interestingly, truly successful purchases are rarely afraid of time. If an item is really necessary today, it will remain necessary in a few days as well. If a decision is truly reasonable, additional time will only strengthen confidence in its correctness. But purchases based solely on emotions usually begin to lose their attractiveness already in the first day. That is why the wealthiest people often look much calmer at the moment of making financial decisions. They do not allow circumstances to hurry them. They are not afraid to miss an opportunity because they understand a simple truth. It is better to lose a doubtful deal than to lose money because of one's own haste. But a legitimate question arises: how to turn this rule from an interesting idea into a habit that will work every day and protect your money automatically, even when emotions are especially strong. In practice, the 24-hour rule works only when it becomes a habit, not a one-time experiment. Many people agree with its logic, but continue to act the old way. The reason is simple. At the moment of strong desire, it always seems to a person that the current situation is an exception. Therefore, it is important to determine in advance for yourself the conditions under which the rule will turn on automatically. For example, one can decide that any purchase more expensive than a certain amount requires a mandatory pause. For one person, it can be $100. For another, $1,000. The size of the sum is not so important. It is important to create a clear boundary, after which emotions no longer get the right to make a decision independently. When a desire to acquire something expensive arises, it is useful not just to wait, but to ask oneself several questions. Will I be using this in a year? Does this purchase solve a real problem or merely create pleasant feelings for a short time? Would I buy this thing if no one ever saw it? What will happen if I don't make this purchase at all? These questions possess amazing power. They force a person to step out of the emotional state and look at the situation from the outside. Very often already at this stage, it becomes clear that the initial desire was significantly stronger than the real need. Some people go even further and use an additional technique. They mentally imagine that the necessary sum is already in their hands in cash. Then they ask themselves a question. What would I prefer to get right now? This money or this product? The answer is by no means always obvious. Over time, the rule begins to work practically automatically. The habit of buying under the influence of the moment disappears. A person stops reacting to every discount, advertisement, or loud promise of benefit. Instead, the ability appears to calmly observe one's desires, not allowing them to manage the wallet. The most interesting thing is that after a few months of such practice, it is not only expenses that change. The very attitude toward money changes. It stops being perceived as a resource that must be spent as quickly as possible. A person begins to see in it a tool that opens opportunities and creates freedom of choice. This is where the true value of the 24-hour rule becomes clear. In reality, it was never exclusively about purchases. Purchases are only the outer side of this story. Far more important is what happens inside the person. Most people are convinced that wealth begins with a high salary, a successful business, or profitable investments. However, many generations of financially successful families came to another conclusion. Real wealth begins at the moment when a person learns to manage their own desires. After all, money rarely disappears suddenly. Most often, it goes gradually, through hundreds of decisions that seem insignificant. Each thoughtless purchase takes away a part of future opportunities. Each emotional expense makes the path to financial independence a little longer. And vice versa. Each conscious decision strengthens the foundation of future well-being. That is why the 24-hour rule survived generations. It does not depend on the level of income, the state of the economy, or the country of residence. It worked when people paid with coins. It works today when a purchase can be made with a single touch of the screen. The secret of its effectiveness lies in its amazing simplicity. It does not require financial education, complex calculations, or special skills. It requires only one thing: the readiness to put a pause between desire and action. This is the wisdom that was understood by people who managed to preserve their well-being over decades. They knew that the most dangerous struggle takes place not in the market, not in the bank, and not in business. It takes place inside the person themselves. Defeating one's own haste, a person preserves money. Preserving money, they get new opportunities. And new opportunities over time turn into what many call wealth.